It's my great pleasure to introduce the artist Mernet Larsen. For over six decades, Marinette Larsen has been exploring, questioning, mapping, and demonstrating the possibilities of painting. The result of that journey is a strange and yet coherent body of work in which one can follow the clues and visual evidence to discover and appreciate how one thing led to another. Over the same period, Marinette's work has been exhibited continually, and over the last decade, she has received wide attention and acclaim for her remarkably original figurative paintings. Her work has been included in many group exhibitions, and she has had over 30 solo exhibitions, including a retrospective of 60 years of work at the Tampa Museum of Art in 2017. Her work is also in many public and private collections, including the Whitney Museum, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, the Carnegie Museum of Art, the Walker Art Center, and the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. Last, while she was creating her astounding body of work, for 35 years, she was a professor at the University of South Florida in Tampa, where she had an enormous influence on several generations of artists who had the good fortune to study with her and wonder with her about the possibilities of painting. And I know this to be true because long ago, I was one of those fortunate students. So it's a pleasure to have you here, Marinette, and this would normally be the moment when you would come to the podium to great applause. But instead, in our kind of strange moment, the audience is out there looking into their screens, and we're here. And so, but regardless, it's really wonderful to have you here today. And
thanks, Aaron. And it's really great to be here.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about and looking at these first questions. Aaron gave me all of your questions, which are just great questions. Any one of them we could spend a whole hour talking about. But I was going to suggest that we sort of skip over the first one, which was about my background, about my life history and everything. On Hyperallergic this weekend, there was an interview with me that talked about my early life at great length. So if you're curious about that, you can go to that and you can move on. I will mention though, one of the things, as Aaron said, I taught at USF for many decades. And one of the wonderful things about teaching is, or at least for me, was the kind of dialogue that you have with students. And it becomes very much a give and take kind of thing, where I can honestly say that much of my work evolved in relationship to dialogues with students and also to problems and projects I gave to students. For example, I remember when Aaron was in my painting 2 class, maybe, I gave a project where they had to divide up into groups, 3 people in a group, I think, to do a collaborative painting. And they had to stretch a large canvas on the wall, about 5 by 6. And then they had to all work on this painting together, which was probably bad for everybody's ego, but they did that. And I think I gave them prompts, like you have to now think about Hans Hoffman, or you have to now think about the meaning of scale or size or different things they had to do. So they had to respond to that as I gave it. And and it was so exciting, the paintings that you guys did in that class, that I started to do some of those myself at home. I'd stretch up the canvas, I'd put in a paper bag a bunch of prompts. I just have nothing to go on except for my prompts in my bag, and have to make decisions based on that. That led to paintings that I did for the next 15 years that were quite abstract. So that kind of thing happened. I don't know, Aaron, if you remember that.
I do remember it. I actually remember one of your comments that we had a cat. Someone had painted a cat into the painting, and your comment was, "I'm surprised you could remember that much about a cat." So, anyway. But I remember that it being interesting and perplexing, frankly, but it's good.
Yeah. So anyway, one of the things, I'm trying to think about some things that differentiate me from the common thing that artists did when they went through history. One thing was that I was lucky in that when I went to high school, my best friend's father taught painting at the University of Florida. So I was very aware of contemporary art by the time I was 15 or 16. And he had a huge studio and did these giant paintings that looked like de Koonings. And it all was very glamorous and romantic, I thought. It was probably one reason that I decided to go into art. Another thing was that I taught art history for about 5 or 6 years. And when I first, I taught at the University of Oklahoma for a couple of years before I went to the University of South Florida. And in both places, I taught art history, not like survey or beginning classes. I taught detailed classes on Renaissance and Baroque and contemporary and modern, everything. I taught graduate seminars. I taught seminars on Cezanne. I wasn't a good art history student, but somehow they had the idea that it would be better if there was an articulate, relatively articulate studio person teaching art history instead of historians who always were so boring and just talked about names and dates. Of course, that wasn't what art history was, but that's what we thought of as art history that studio did. So they did have a lot of places, I think, have studio people teaching art history. And so I learned a huge amount of art history because I had to all learn it as I went. And that has had a huge impact, of course, on my work over the years. So there's that difference.
Also, I'll mention that you mentioned in, I think, the video and also the interview in Hyperallergic, the enormous amount of travel that you've done to, in a way, to become internationally aware of other cultures and things. So.
Well, I lived in New York. I was in love with New York for the time I was about 16. So I used every opportunity. I spent a summer there when I was 21 and worked at Art Students League. But in the 70s, I was in New York for most of the 1970s, back and forth. I didn't quit my job at USF. I started a program in New York for USF students. And I also took leaves of absence without pay, taught other places. But in 1980, I decided to make a commitment to staying in USF and in Florida. And one reason was because I thought that in some ways New York was kind of inbred, and that it was kind of repetitive and boring, the things that were being talked about all the time. And I thought it would make sense to have a more international perspective rather than being limited by this New York perspective. And being in teaching in the university, in particular USF, I had ample opportunities both to get grants to travel to Japan, to China, to India, but also just to take time off and go to Europe and Mexico and lots of places. So I thought, plus I had plenty of time to work on my work at this particular school. They allowed us enough time to work. So it seemed like a much better situation than being in New York. And I think it has served me well to not have been tied to New York. It was an agonizing decision at the time I made it, but in retrospect, it seems like it was a good choice. And I've always thought that universities were kind of little art worlds in themselves, and often strong art worlds in themselves, very much like the Siena and Rome and Florence. These had their own art worlds with great artists in them. It's possible teaching in a school and working with students to develop a whole art world there, to be part of a whole art world there. Aaron, do you find that?
Yes, absolutely. And remember my experience at USF and USF being really the center of the Tampa art world, and that is the art department was the nucleus, and less true here in Houston because there's a much larger art scene around it. But in any event, those are excellent points and a broad view, I think, which is important. Let me ask you, Yeah, go to the questions, Marinette, so that we can, I know we're not going to get through all of these because literally I got maybe 40 questions that I then synthesized into, 22 questions or something, and we won't get through them, but let's try a few. And I think that, as you know, because I share them with you, the first question, which is like it's a synthesis of probably 5 or 6 different students and people asking about things, which I'll read it to you, is that not surprisingly, there were many questions about your use of linear perspective. And can you talk about how you think about the use of perspective? What does perspective allow or obscure? And its uses and limitations in describing our experience in the world and things around us.
Yeah, I would love to talk about that. And as it happens, I just gave a talk where I have a whole section devoted to that. So I hope if we can get this up here where I can show the slides, images that I use.
Let's do the screen share.
Do I go down to screen share?
Yeah, do you have your PowerPoint open?
Yeah.
Okay, the PowerPoint's open, go to the screen share and then just like
okay.
PowerPoint and you
wait and screen share. Is it coming up?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Perspective is your point of view. Where are you as a viewer? I think that's extremely important to consider. And I think I've always been in retrospect, always been thinking about that. This painting on the left is a painting I did in 1967 of the inside of a car. And I was trying to deal with cars, the essence of cars. And I thought, well, the essence of car is that I'm inside it. Well, how do you paint something when you're inside it? So I used the curved surface of a teapot, of one of those metal teapots, so that it warped the whole surface so I could see the whole inside. So that was one instance of looking at a perspective, right? Perspective, seeing something from the inside. In the 70s, when I was in New York, I did a whole series of paintings based on looking at people, because that's all I did in New York. I sat around in Washington Square and the Metropolitan Museum and looked at people. And when you look at people, you're not looking at a view. You're not seeing a scene. You're seeing a bunch of people and your eye is moving around and seeing them. So I wanted to do a painting that had all these multiple points of view that didn't gestalt into a view, but kept you moving and roving and captured that perspective, the perspective of being a spectator observing the world. And I did those for about 5 years, and then I wasn't able to do them anymore because I just decided I didn't want to be a spectator, and I didn't want my paintings to be about being a spectator. So I started studying. I just opened everything up. I just quit doing those and started from scratch, in effect. And this painting on the left was done about 1980. And I have been doing these studies of Renaissance painting, and Renaissance painters often started with geometric structures. They would structure the body in geometric forms, and then they would add things on top of it. So in my how-to book, How to Paint Like Vermeer, it showed, this box, and then you added the details, and then you added the tones, and then you glazed color on top. So I did a whole bunch of those for a couple of years. And I found I liked the boxes that I started with better than I liked them after I stuck everything on them, and that they sort of opened up the possibility of getting a point of view, and rather than just being this totally detached observer. However, I didn't know where to go with that. And what I did is they became more and more abstract. And I'm not going to talk about that at all now, and that's not related to your question. So I'm going to skip here 15 years. So the painting on the right was done about 1999, I would guess, 1999, measuring itself. And as you can see, now I have a parallel perspective. Nothing is in, the one on the left is still in a very conventional perspective. The bodies may be blocky, but the perspective is very conventional. It's facing you. There's a horizon line. It's sort of a grid. And then the one on the right has a grid and parallel perspective on the floor. Everything is in parallel perspective, like in Japanese painting or in isometric perspective that architects use, so that nothing really goes away from you. Everything is equally close to you and equally far away from you. And it seemed like that put you in a position of being more inside and outside. I also made nothing perpendicular to the surface. Everything was in the diagonal in relationship to the picture plane, so that you as a viewer, your perspective is that you're not sure where you are. You're not sure where you are relative to this. You're more inside and outside. So I did a number of things in parallel perspective. I did a bunch of faculty meetings. And on the one on the left, which is again, parallel perspective, the figure on the right is exactly the same size as the figure on the left. Every line is parallel and the bricks in the wall and everything. But I wanted to do paintings of faculty meetings, and faculty meetings were somewhat large. There were lots of people. And when I used parallel perspective, they just seemed sort of arbitrary and cluttered. And I took all these pictures of faculty meetings, and I decided that I thought, well, what would happen if I just turned my photograph upside down? And what if I became the vanishing point? What if I, the viewer, became the vanishing point? What would happen? So I turned the photographs upside down, traced the tables, and then I constructed the figures that were exactly like they were in the photograph, except reversed. I reversed them so that the figures in the distance, oops, sorry. Well, what happened? Yeah, the figures in the distance were really huge and the figures in the forefront were very small. So psychologically, I really liked what happened when I did that. For example, in this one, the huge figure in the background, it was the only Black person on the faculty. And in the middle is one of the only women. Most of the people on the faculty for the first 10 or 15 years that I was there, almost all the faculty were white men. Yeah, this was true everywhere. But in putting this in reverse perspective, the most important characters became the Black man and the white woman. This was a total accidental byproduct of having reversed the usual way that you see them. And I really love the kind of psychological situation that set up. I also liked that by seeing this in this completely unconventional perspective, you're interested. I mean, I think you're interested more than you would be if you just saw a picture of a faculty meeting, which nobody has at least been interested in. So this became a way of getting you involved. But visually as perspective, keep on this target of why I use perspective the way I do. Well, I guess I've been answering it that it's giving you both a sense of not knowing where your location is. You basically have a sense of vertigo on the right. You're basically tiny, infinitesimally small, and things are growing around you, up around you. And that becomes your perspective of the situation.
Can I ask you, Marinette,
Yeah.
you mentioned the psychological effect of that, and I'm wondering about it's related, of course, the emotional effect. Like, how does it make you feel as much as how it makes you sort of think and react as a psychological being?
Yeah, I don't often, as I probably should, make the distinction between the psychological and the emotional, because I don't think of myself as a gushy emotional person. So I usually use the word psychological. But what do you think of the emotional effect?
It produces like I would just say in general, I would rather hear you go on about it, of course, but I think that the reverse perspective creates anxiety.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, I guess that's natural. Yeah, because you are vertigo is an anxious situation.
Yeah, and perhaps you're as you said,
You don't know where you are. Where am I in this? I'm unstable. You can't find the ground. You're not sharing the same Newtonian space that.
Yeah, well, you identified the viewer is at the vanishing point. They're the smallest.
Yes, yeah.
So that can be anxious, I guess.
Yeah. So, so here's another one, a faculty meeting on the left. It became very challenging to figure out, once I made these paintings big, and this painting on the left is about 6 or 7 feet long. In the studies I did, I just had blank space under the tables, but when they were big, I had to account for the legs. And when you put legs in reverse perspective under the table, as you can imagine, they would go off the bottom of the painting and it would flatten the whole thing out. So it took me a month or two to figure out what to do about that. And I ended up with these tiny little legs, which I thought were really funny and therefore maybe I couldn't use. But my husband came in and said, no, they're right. They're right. So I left them, and all the ones I did after that, I used a different space and different scale under the table. Sort of like when you're in a faculty meeting and you look under the tables, it's like there's a whole other world under the tables that you're kind of thinking about. So I like the idea of having that sort of separate space under there. I mean, dealing with an unconventional perspective just allows you to play. I mean, to have a lot more fun with the painting.
What about, can I ask this? The two images that you have on the screen right now, of course, they're both meetings, but I think, well, is that the Situation Room? No, it's a cabinet meeting. That's right.
This is a cabinet meeting on the right.
And so the cabinet meeting and the faculty meeting, they have different weight in the world.
Right.
So how do you think about that?
Well, I didn't think about that. That's interesting, but I didn't think about it quite that way. Maybe I did, now that you mention it. But I worked on Obama's campaign. I got kind of interested in politics a little bit for a while. And so I got intrigued with just how the physical reality of the meetings, cabinet meetings and the Situation Room meetings were. So I did a lot of research on them on Google. But then when I got all these people around the table, well, it's an oval table. With the faculty meetings, they were like this U-shaped thing. And it seemed like a different predicament when you had an oval table, and I had to get those figures in the front out of the way. So I turned them upside down, which I never do in the faculty meetings. So it's as if everything in the one on the right, which is probably about 5 years after the one on the left, everything has been unfolded. The walls have been unfolded. The photographers or observers on the side have been unfolded. So it's maybe a more omnipotent sense in the one on the right as a viewer, because it's so unfolded. But it's also in reverse perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Got that, yeah.
But I really wanted to show you this because I just never can believe it when I see it. On the left is the photograph that I got off Google of the table in the big cabinet meetings. Okay. The one on the right, I traced that table on the left and turned it upside down. And that shape on the right is identical to the shape on the left. Now, even now looking at it, I cannot believe that. Can you? I mean, but it's the same shape upside down.
Yeah, when you lead me to it, I can see that. Yeah.
And so then what I did is, again, the figures that are just these 3 women in the back, tiny little characters, they became the central characters in this cabinet meeting.
Right.
And as well as the legs and hands of the men standing around watching in the back.
Nice. Let me shift gears or slightly anyway, and go to the fact that you have mentioned, just in terms of the way that the paintings are made, there's 2 questions that I'll sort of put together. That you talked about your process, and you do the sketch, the study, and then the fully resolved painting. And then it's sort of the question, like, and then you put in, like you mentioned, months, and I think you might have characterized it as 100 hours on a painting. And then combined with that, the idea of the idea of skill. Yeah, you mentioned being more interested in ideas and imagination than in skills and sensitivity. And so can you expand on that idea? And I'm curious about what you think about the idea of de-skilling that some contemporary artists have adopted. And so how
Yeah.
you paintings.
Yeah, that was sort of an intriguing question. Well, the quote of me saying that thing about imagination being more important than skill was in the context of a conversation about my starting out as a painter when I was young. Like when I was in high school, I was more interested in I wasn't one of those people that wanted to prove I could paint, like draw like a photograph. So now I think that what I said about that is probably true of most painters, isn't it? That most painters in the high art world anyway think of imagination and ideas as being more important than just skill, but art is performative. It's a performance as well as a creation, unlike music where you often separate the two. But there are really a lot of artists that tend to be more performative, that are just brilliant at it. Brilliant as being performative figurative artists, but also brilliant as performative abstract artists. They're working well within conventions that exist, work closely to those conventions, but they're just brilliant at the performance aspect of that, which I hugely respect. But I don't know if I'm capable of it or not. I've never had enough interest to pursue it, but I never was one of the best people at doing skilled things in my classes. I was good enough, but I wasn't great. As far as the people, there's a look, that kind of look, naive look, that some artists have done. I can't speak to their motives or why they might have done that. I think that generally speaking, it's, you get, and I mean, having spent myself almost a decade doing paintings that were based on photographic information that were very time consuming and care consuming in terms of technique. I think that when I went to, say, from paintings that looked more like the thing on the left and the one on the right, is because there was too much information. There's too much information in a photographic or a extremely rendered thing that you don't really need. Like what a body looks like. People have arms and legs, and all this stuff. It'd be like if somebody wrote a novel and they said Joe walked in the room, he had 2 arms and 2 legs. And, you always reduce it to what you.
Oh, you froze on my screen. I don't know if I'm still.
It's a human figure. Then you can say more about other things, and you can say more about relationships. You can say more about space. You can say more about philosophy, anything. You can just say more if you don't have to be allegiant to all the information that's in direct observation or in a photograph.
Well, that's a good say. I can segue to this question then. How do you, the question is, how do you determine the ratio of figure to ground in your work? As the questioner says, there's always so much negative space relative to the figures. And related to that, do you feel any kinship with the paintings of Joseph Albers and Al Held? Albers making the particular colored spaces, and Al Held making geometric, fantastic geometric spaces.
Yeah, well, that's a sort of interesting complex of question there. When I was in San Francisco working with Nathan Oliveira in 1960, I was filling this whole canvas with things. And he said, how come you're filling the whole canvas? I said, well, because you're not supposed to have a background. And he said, well, what's wrong with the background? Well, at the height of abstract expressionism, everything was about total activation of the surface in the 1950s and 60s. You had to have something going on everywhere. You could not have any just empty negative space. So there's that probably lurking in my distant past somewhere. I frankly, though, have never thought of my paintings as having a lot of negative space. I mean, look at that painting on the right, there's not a lot of negative space. Maybe there's a lot of space that isn't people or something, but
I agree with you.
I don't think of my paintings as having a lot of negative space.
I totally agree with you, but I'm just thinking that with the standard equation of figure and ground,
yeah,
quite often the figures take up, a small amount of the available sort of canvas real estate,
yeah,
and the ground that is also full of an enormous amount of information is other. But I agree with you that it's activated, certainly.
yeah. But as far as El Held is concerned, I really like his paintings often, especially the ones where he sort of has optical sensations of things that should be in front being behind. And I think there's a kind of vertigo often in his paintings, some of the later ones that I really like. I don't relate well to Albers. I took the Albers colors class when I was a student, but I've never been very interested in Albers.
Okay.
That was a curious connection.
Yeah, I think there was something in the interview where you mentioned Albers, and so perhaps that's sparked the questioner.
I know where that came from. When I was an undergraduate student, well, most of the people I worked with had studied with Albers at Yale. So, yeah. So if you weren't going to be de Kooning, you could be Albers. That's what my
those are your choices.
Was when I was an undergraduate. You had to be either intellectually oriented abstract artist like Albers, or an emotionally oriented artist like de Kooning. Those were your options.
Nice. Okay, let me. We must go to the influences. Another, beyond the real intense interest in how you're using perspective, which I think you've like talked a bit about effectively. There's the interest in how you spring off of other artists' work, and particularly El Lissitzky, and so can you talk further about that relationship? And I have a very specific question, which is, because of your interest in El Lissitzky's work, do you align yourself with the constructivist idea that the traditional easel painter is transformed into the artist as engineer in charge of organizing life and all of its aspects?
Well, that's interesting. There's somebody who knows more about El Lissitzky than I do. I haven't read a whole lot about it. I just deal with his paintings almost like found objects. However, recently I've been reading more about, I've done a lot of paintings based on El Lissitzky's compositions, and I'm always paranoid that if he were alive, he would be horrified at what I'm doing to his paintings. Because in the light of constructivism and suprematism, there was this move towards purity, away from references. But the more I read about Lissitzky, the more I think he might have found them okay, because he was more oriented towards art opening out into the world, becoming more. And he was making connections with other media like photography and collage, and as he didn't live to be that old, but he was moving into the paintings that I use were probably done within a 4 or 5 year period of his life. He was quite young. I don't think he was involved in doing anything like what I'm doing, but anyway, he still might be at home. But as far as those ideas of Malevich and Lissitzky, and that they're linked to Marxism or to the Russian Revolution, and no, I don't feel no affinity with that at all. I mean, I'm not.
Can you show some images at all of how you sort of use this relates to another question also with El Lissitzky, but how you synthesize the different references.
Okay. Well, I don't usually synthesize different references consciously. I usually pick something. For example, here's an example. Is that up on your screen?
It,
Yeah, on the left is a painting of from Udaipur, India, of a fort, and then a procession coming from this fort that's going out. There's hundreds of figures in here, and when I look at this painting, what I would see is, if I detach myself, was these two characters leaning over a baby, the red fort on the bottom being the baby, and that. So I thought, well, what would happen if I deal with this as a Rorschach test? This is what I can imagine this as being, and depart as little as possible, but turn it into this set of parents with their baby. So, and when I start with something like totally unrelated to what the subject matter is, it works literally like a Rorschach. In other words, I would never sit down in my studio and say, I think I'll do a painting of a couple looking at a baby. That just never would have interested me in the slightest. But the painting that I was looking at made me think of that and think about that. And I thought, there must be something in there. Then when I stuck with the composition as closely as I could, I don't know if you can see this very well on this little screen, but on the top of the painting that zigzags is a zigzag of buildings that the people are walking between. So I carried those zigzags over into this character's construction of the back, which to me is the best thing about that painting, is the structure of the back, and it makes that painting have a certain kind of power, I hope, and not be real sappy and sentimental. And so that generally, when I've used any source, and here's another one, I used a lot of things from Japanese paintings. Not this particular one isn't the source I used for the one on the right, but I would often turn them upside down or sideways, and then I would see them as being something entirely different, entirely unrelated to whatever they represented before. So that, for example, there's on the painting on the right, there's a figure holding up a baby, but in the source that I used, that was actually a column in a piece of architecture upside down. So I would translate these things into things. Rorschach, again, I would treat them as Rorschach tests. I'm finding out subject matter I didn't know that I was that interested in, although I knew I wanted to do morals, and this is of a moral. And then I would find the tension between that subject matter and that construction, the structure of that image that I was so drawn to begin with. The reason I was looking at it to begin with was because I loved the way it looked. I loved the structure of it. So how could I take that structure and translate that structure into subject matter and content that was deeply related to me?
Interesting. And going back briefly to the parents with the baby,
yeah,
and the idea of the emotional effect of the paintings, that you titled the painting "Ah."
Oh, yeah. Like you always say "awe" when you're supposed to say "awe" when you see a baby.
Yeah.
But it's also the double entendre of you are in fact awed by the fact this creature exists.
Yeah, but I'm just saying you're confirming a sort of emotional reaction that I think I had to the painting when I saw this, and so forth. And anyway, there's that.
Yeah. So then the Lisitsky's, to get to the Lisitsky's, here's a Lisitsky painting on the left. And here's the painting that ended up, and I think, Aaron, you had the one in between. I actually did an abstract painting in the 80s based on this Lisitsky painting. It's kind of a deconstruction of it. And then 20 years later, I used my own abstract painting as the source for this painting of Shoppers. Although I look back, you can see it on its side. Probably it's obvious, isn't it?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
And
so
it's interesting.
Thought, well, what would this be if this, again, Rorschaching it? Well, this is an interesting composition to me, especially when I look at it on the side. I really like it. Well, what is it? Well, it's shoppers in the mall. It's these two guys, and they're carrying these packages. And they look like the kind of packages that some guys would carry. I mean, you wouldn't see a bunch of women carrying those packages. It's men and women stereotypically shop for different things. And then that gave me an excuse to actually mix different perspectives. Like in this, there's reverse perspective. There's also parallel perspective. You can see the axis of the foreground figure is different than the axis of this background figure, right? Anyway, that's that. The Lasitskis, these also were done from Lasitskis. Let's see if I can find any with the, oh, it disappeared. Well, very well. But these were both done from Lasitski compositions in a similar way. And I couldn't really start a painting from Lasitski if this other reading didn't really take over, so that I no longer saw it as being an abstract painting. I saw it as being a man on a raft fishing, period. There it was, so I had to make that work. And then the reason these take so long is somebody asked on these or asked how I put up with the doldrums. There aren't any doldrums in the middle of working on these paintings. There's total indecision and trial and error. For example, in this one on the left, that diagonal where the water ends wasn't anything. There wasn't anything like that in the Lasitski painting. And for a long time, I had water going up the whole back of the painting, just solid water. And I had a little figure on the lower left, a little further down, that was more where it is in the Lasitski, but it looked too much like Huck, Finn, and Jim, Huckleberry Finn, and with a sort of role reversal, and it became a kind of too political statement or something.
Well, let me ask you this, Marinette. You just remind me, in the video, there's a wonderful passage where you're talking about your actual process of trying things, where you're cutting out paper pieces and putting them on the painting with water and eventually settling on where they'll go and adhering them permanently. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, just in general, when I started painting, after doing sketches in my sketchbook, I do this 19 by 24 color study on Bristol board paper. And then I enlarge that very meticulously, so that, because it seems like the tensions have to be very exact. And then I lay in all the colors so that the big painting looks exactly like the study. And then I spend another month or two on the painting after that, because that's where making it convincing, making that world convincing comes in. And also it's where finding out why I'm even doing that, or why it's so interesting to me. So what I'm doing often is a lot of, like, as I say with that, I had practically given up on this painting when I decided to put that diagonal in with that water. But then it took me forever to figure out how to paint the water. It ended up being painted almost naturalistically with little waves and things. Probably can't see it on this scale. And then I ended up putting in. So I take, like, well, okay, I'm not going to have that little figure on the left. What am I going to have? So I take some tracing paper and I lay it on the canvas, and then I take some pencil or charcoal and I draw in a possibility. And then I would lift it off, and then I would put it on my table, and I would trace it and paint a possibility. And then I might paint it in different color set. And then I would get it wet, I cut it out, get it wet, and put it up there, stick it up there. And when I found something that that worked, then I would glue it down with acrylic medium. And I liked what happened with that for a lot of reasons. I like the paintings to look artificial. I like them to look made. I don't want them to look slick. In reproductions, they tend to look kind of slick. But in actual paintings, they're kind of funky, and you see a lot of evidence of the process, pencil marks and things showing. And you see this tracing paper, which sometimes shrivels up or has little wrinkles in it. And it gets away from the plasticky feel that I don't like or relate to in acrylic. So that's what I'm doing for those 2 months. Is I'm just the painting on the right was just a killer painting for me, because I got this reverse perspective of this little tiny picture and this great big batter, which I really like the monumentality of the batter. And then there's the problem of, well, this is reverse perspective. I should have a huge catcher. And I did some studies then on a separate piece of paper with great big catchers. And they just made this batter look puny. And I really liked the idea of the batter being monumental. So then I had to try all sorts of other decisions. And then in the Lisitsky painting, there was a arc right in the middle of the painting where the catcher's arm is. It seemed really important. So I had to get the arc in there. So that's why he's reaching out as if the ball is going to be thrown too far to the left. It's a ball. Anyway, but then I must have spent 20 hours trying to figure out what to do with that catcher's head. Like I had it behind the batter. I had the head with just half I thought it should be facing us. I thought the catcher should be facing us. So I had all these confrontational heads. I thought the batter should be African American, but then it just didn't. It got lost in the sky. So those are the kinds of things that that went on and on. I thought the sky is too. The bleachers. Again, I thought they should be huge. Should I have just this mob of heads in the background for the bleachers? Just big heads. No. But I ended up with this sort of more conventional space for the bleachers, which I didn't like. And then the sky was really conventional. And one thing I do, I don't know if any of you do this when you work, but I'll take pictures of the painting while I'm working on it. And then I'll put it into Photoshop, and then I'll print it. And then I'll work on my little print of the painting. I'll do things to the little print of the painting. So, and so I ran this through the thing, and I was running out of colored ink. And what happened is that these, what happens when those pink stripes on the blue ground were just perfect. So that's just perfect. They're like that exact kind of light in the evening when they turn the bleacher lights on. And the lights onto the ball field, but it's getting dark and the moon is rising and there's this kind of afterglow. It's just perfect, but it was totally serendipitous byproduct of that process.
Yeah, well, that's wonderful to hear that description, because it gives a real history of the testing and trying of things, and how the painting is an act of sort of figuring it out visually and revising as need be, and then finally settling on things. And a funny thing about the batter, the batter, arguably, when the batter's up at the plate getting ready to hit, he's the most important player on the field. And yet he's in this painting titled Bunt, as I recall. It's the puniest sort of hit that you can do. You're just trying to put the ball away.
I know.
So it's a minor thing.
And also, he doesn't have any arms.
Yeah, that too. Yeah, but and you reminded me of something when I was there at USF visiting your studio. I remember seeing a painting that was, I want to say it was a painting of a dead dog, or the dead dog was the subject with its legs up in the air, and the paws of the dog were like wadded up pieces of paper towel that had been taped down with masking tape.
Yeah, it was called Dead or Sleeping. And actually, I thought of them as figures. They were sort of abstract people, but the person was lying there like a dead dog. This person had all four legs I mean, two arms and two legs in the air, as
Yeah.
if it were a dog. So I know exactly. In fact, I still have that painting.
Yeah, and I remember seeing that use of materials and thinking how crazy that was. I didn't share that with you then, but in any event, it seemed so strange. This is a painting, and you're using these unconventional materials, which of course has become, a signature of the work. So
Yeah.
let me ask this question. There was also, I responded, many other people responded to the recounting of your the effect that the tale of Pinocchio had on you.
Yeah.
And so let me read these two questions to you. It says, in the video interview, you share the anecdote about making a life-size paper doll and praying for it to become a real boy. I love this story for many reasons, and it made me wonder how you deal with the tensions between the animate and inanimate in your paintings. And then this is the second part that you can respond to this however you want. Another question. The story of Pinocchio, he went from being a sentient piece of wood to a puppet with his own soul. Do you ever find that you give the subjects in your painting souls? How have you considered the subject of the soul in relationship to your paintings?
Wow. Now, there were 2 or 3 questions in there,
Yeah.
and all good ones. So let me see. Um, one thing I do, and to pile another question in there that was on there about robots and things. I never think of these as being like Legos or robots or cold characters in any way. I think of them as being analogies to people, like analogs to people, substitutes for people, with a minimal amount of information that you need to convey them. And my hope is, and my feeling is, that they do communicate a sense of soul. I don't know if it's a word I would use, although why not? But that they would have a sense um, of these have a life. They have a life or a potential life. In some ways, I think of them as containers, though, for you. I mean, it's the thing I spend the least time on in a painting are the figures. They're usually determined at the beginning and often are not changed at all to the end. And I spend all my time on things like so let's see, wow. All my time on things like that light fixture, or the thing she's wearing. I mean, the characters are established very quickly, and they're very simple and clear. And so lately, I've been thinking, in a way, they're like you could step inside them and be them. They're like empty vessels for us, as viewers. And then the things that surround them are given much more specificity. Um, I pay a lot more. I do more research on what they really look like. And so I do think of these as being humane, I hope, humane paintings, and about humanity and about life, and being somewhat upbeat. I mean, they sometimes are ominous, and they sometimes have bad things implied in them, I guess. But on the whole, I think of them as being somewhat friendly painting, and more and paintings of in which I have high regard for life, for the world, for being alive. And so what were other parts to that question?
That more or less, I think that addresses it. But you drifted into the another question about the whether the comedic or the tragic are part of the work, and also humor. That maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, let's see if any of these open up. some reason these other ones aren't opening up. That have more, because some of the more recent ones have more ominous qualities, people say, to them, and deal more with contemporary things like guns and climate change and so on. I kind of see those things as running side by side, simultaneously. I saw that Hemingway special last night on PBS. Did anyone see that? In which he was basically saying the same thing, that he, was dealing with these horrible things like war, but also dealing with simultaneously with a love of life, an embracing of life. And so I feel like I think the whole reason I started painting, I'm sure, was that I thought that life was a little bit banal and boring, and that it was fine. I was happy. I wasn't unhappy. But I thought that, but I didn't want to be an expressionist because I didn't have all these things to say about how sad I was or how happy I was or how terrible this or that was or anything. I didn't have any kind of agenda like that. What I wanted to do was to find a way to see I was trapped at home. I was in college. I was living at home. I did not want to be living at home when I was at college. So it was like, how do I make the best of this situation? How can you make art, make really ordinary things become interesting and meaningful? And that's been the kind of underlying thing, I think, throughout my whole life, is using art and looking at art and reading literature. All those things are a way of finding, not escape. Like somebody asked about Gulliver's Travels, if that had influenced me, and I've never read that. And I don't usually read things that have to do with science fiction or fantasy, or I like things that are deal very well. And I like Tolstoy, for example. People who deal with the panorama of life, as it is, in its whole range of positive and negative things. So,
well, it's interesting. Your subjects are they run a sort of gamut in that they're and some of my favorites are the things that are banal moments in life. And someone asked about the ordinariness or the everyday event of sitting in a booth eating French fries with your friends, kind of bored, or Lord knows, those of us who've sat in seminars or faculty meetings know that those things can have their moments of banality. And then but you also have a few that are comparatively spectacular, skydiver or misstep, where there's a figure falling off a cliff and so forth. And yet even those paintings seem as though everything is right in the world, the way that you're putting it together structurally. So
yeah. There are disasters sometimes. There's sometimes sort of playful disasters. I mean, they're more like a figure falling off the cliff or seeming to walk off the cliff. There's one that's falling off. There's one that just stepped off, like Roadrunner. That moment where or in cartoons where they run across and they suddenly realize there's no ground underneath their feet, and the moment they realize that, then they fall. And I was sort of thinking of that in that painting too. So it's sort of a state of mind. I felt that captured a state of mind when you are on the verge of making a really disastrous mistake or stepping off a cliff in some way in life. So there's that.
We're right at the 1 hour mark. So let me ask you a couple of last questions. They're the end questions that are sort of circle back to like how you have existed in the art world over these many decades and made what your experience has been like. And the first question is that you mentioned becoming confident enough to go against the trends of the art world at some point. And can you share more about that and what it felt like when you realized that you had that confidence?
Interesting. Well, in some ways, I always had it, because I was sort of stubbornly felt originality was very important. I think even in my family household, there was a feeling that originality was an important thing. So I was kind of stubborn about that. I was probably obnoxious sometimes as a student because I, was doing something and they were telling me I should try something else, and I wanted to do what I wanted to do. So, but at the same time, I think that over time, I think contradictorily, I was very dependent, maybe more than most people, on positive reinforcement. And again, maybe that was my upbringing too, because I had parents that were hugely supportive family. So I was used to getting a lot of pats on the back when I did something right. And then when I didn't, I was really mortified and set back and sometimes stand still. So I think I had a hard time in graduate school. I don't think I did that well in graduate school. And I went to 2 different graduate schools. But I think I was paranoid a lot of the time, insecure about what I was doing. I was arrogant, but those things aren't mutually exclusive. You can feel very arrogant about what you're doing, but at the same time feel totally paranoid and unappreciated and insecure. So
that's
so
the identity of the graduate student.
yeah,
You have to have that.
sort of the essence of being a graduate student, I guess.
Exactly.
So when I do think it's very important for students to for anyone to have a sort of a clear sense of who why you're making art. Not that you just want to be an artist, but do you think there's something in the world that doesn't exist that you might be able to contribute, even if you can't visualize what it is, but you feel like there's something missing maybe in all the art you've ever seen, that you think that maybe you might be able to contribute something? You feel like you might have something to say, you don't maybe know exactly what it is. And there's also that you got into making art for attraction to something or another, like I mentioned Pinocchio, and paper dolls and things like that, as opposed to being interested in color or something when I was little. And so I forget where I was going with this now.
Well, let me say this. You just reminded me of something that I really identified with when you said that you realized at some point that you wanted your paintings to do something, that they had something to do. If you can elaborate on that, even though it's going back to just the formal things of the painting, but
yeah. Well, for one thing, a key concept for me when because I kept journals, and which I would also recommend everybody do, and probably most of you do, but I kept journals up until quite recently, probably for about 50 or 60 years, and have them all piled up. But I wrote so I could go back and see what I thought, then. And I said when I was 20, I said, I think that what I want to do is I do not want to make art about style. I don't want to find a style. I want the subject matter always to determine how it wants to be painted, because what you see determines how you see. And that was just sort of a key thing for me. What you're looking at determines how you organize it. I was at the height of formalism where it doesn't matter if you're doing a figure or a landscape or whatever, it's all form. No, it's not all form. It is orchestrated information, orchestrated according to what you recognize. So the issue of recognition was something that I tapped into very early and has stayed with me, for forever as a very key central,
Do you
central kind of
remember?
issue.
Do you remember the story that you told about walking through MoMA as a young artist and wondering what to make of it, what to make of these paintings, and then you saw one and you finally saw, oh, that's it. Do you remember this?
Yeah, there's maybe two stories. Well, I haven't forgotten them because I always end up telling them.
I'm remembering it from 30 years ago.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's one story where I was looking at Malevich. I mean, I taught art history. I knew about modern art. I'd done it and everything. It wasn't like I was, off the farm. But I went in, I admitted to myself, well, I don't really relate to these Malevich paintings that much at all. Maybe I'm not really an artist. And then I thought, I wonder what would happen if I looked at one of these paintings and pretended it was a figurative painting.
Oh.
So then I did. I looked at this Malevich painting that's often hanging in the MoMA in the hallway there, and I started to see it as figures and people doing things and things. And I thought, well, what's happening here? I'm seeing the painting better. I mean, I'm not seeing the figures instead of the painting. I'm just seeing the painting better. And then I thought, well, I wonder what would happen if I use these paintings as springboards, for figurative paintings. And then the other thing, and maybe this is the event you're referring to, I was living in New York, and I was living in a building with all these color field painters, Greenbergites. And there was a big, and I was totally intimidated by them. I mean, you would go to a party in the building and Clement Greenberg would be there and everybody would be sitting around his feet like he was a guru. And if one of the artists started to talk, he would say, shut up. I'm the one that's supposed to talk. You're supposed to paint. Artists paint, critics talk. But that was the atmosphere that I was in. So I went to see an Ellisitsky show. I mean, not an Ellisitsky show, but an Olitsky show, not to be confused. Olitsky, who was a famous color field painter then, at the Whitney. And I was wandering around in the show and I was very depressed. I was thinking, I'm not really an artist. I don't relate to this at all. This is what art is. I don't relate to it. I'm not an artist. Maybe I'll become a filmmaker. Maybe I'll become a novelist. And then I turned a corner and all of a sudden I saw this incredible color field painting. And 5 seconds later, I realized I was looking out the window. They have these shaped windows at the Whitney. They're sort of, rhomboids or whatever. And so when I looked out, I saw a color field painting, and it was incredible. But it was just the wall of the building across the street, and the windows. So is that the incident you're thinking of?
Yes.
Yeah.
We have our epiphanies where we find them. Yes.
Yeah. So then that started me totally on doing working from first off my window and from my face and things where I just looked at little pieces of color field, and added these color fields together. And when I started to work with photographic information, I was dealing with them as perceptual units, little color fields, building color fields. So, but it was like the day between it, and that happened. I'm sure a lot of you have had this experience where you can go from the deepest depression and totally sure that you're no good, and nothing's going to happen. And then a couple minutes later, you suddenly have the key or the clue, and everything gets suddenly clear, and you have a whole vista opens for you. You don't have this too often in life, but once in a while you have these kind of epiphanies, but they always seem to be preceded by the depths of despair.
Yeah.
The work.
And as you relayed that, it happened in the last place you would have expected it to happen.
Yeah.
Springboard to the next work. So yeah. Let me just a couple more questions. This one that you've been showing consistently throughout your career, but it's only relatively recently that you've received such intense attention, and deservedly. So it seems like the questioner is saying, so it seems like the world took a long time to catch up to you.
I would like to blame the world.
So that's how
but it's not true, for a number of reasons. One is, well, I really, when I went back to Tampa, I thought, well, I'm a researcher, and there was much less emphasis on career then than there is now. I mean, now you can't even teach in an art department without having to pay extreme attention to your career and to your shows where you're having exhibitions and things. But I thought, I'm being paid to be a researcher, and that's freed me up to not have to think about commercial things like selling my paintings and so on. So until I was in my 50s, I only showed in university contexts, other universities and schools, or maybe sometimes museums, but never in galleries. But my first art gallery show was in Sarasota, Florida, when I was in my mid-50s. So if I was doing great stuff, nobody was having the opportunity to see it. But I also was working, I still work slowly, but I was working really slowly because I was really into teaching, and that was very time consuming. But on the other hand, I think it was more the former, that I didn't want to deal with the commercial aspect of art. So there's another epiphany moment. I was looking at all these photographs at a show once of all these writers, and I'm really big on, I mean, I'm a reader, addicted to reading. So there was a show of all these, Gertrude Stein, James Joyce, all these writers, photographs of them. I was looking around the room, and it suddenly hit me that the only reason I was able to read those writers was because they had dirtied their hands and gone out into the commercial world and gotten their work published. Nobody came to them, they weren't off somewhere doing it. They had to go and become very active. And then as I read more, I found that even people like Cezanne were much more careerists than we think they were, or Van Gogh for that matter. It just seemed to me to be really stupid not to be getting my work out of the world. It's just like a real turning point. And from then on, I worked on trying to have more shows and have galleries and so on. So that was it wasn't the and then I think also that in about 2000, when I was about 60, a lot of things came together in my work. I think that I worked dialectically. I would work one way, and then I would have a strong reaction against it and quit working for a year or two. And then I would do something entirely different. And then I would have another crisis, and then I would synthesize those previous things. And so it's this Hegelian thing of synthesis, antithesis, or thesis, antithesis, synthesis throughout my whole life. So I think when I was about 60, I decided that my heart really had always, because I've been working abstractly for about 15 years, but I wasn't real, they weren't really abstract, but people were seeing, they read as abstract. My heart is really in representational painting. I really would rather be a Renaissance painter and get to do all the things that they got to do, but you can't do that now. So I'd have to find a way to do representational paintings that took into considerations the things we now know living in the 21st century about perception, about the universe, about everything. So I think that the work I was doing starting 20 years ago became a really important synthesis time for my work. And so my work actually got a lot better. And it certainly got a lot more interesting because nobody's interested in the work I did before then. I have plenty of those older paintings, nobody's interested in them.
Well, just a comment, having looked at the progression of the work, and as I said in the introduction, I wrote that with as accurately as I could, and that I thought that there was a strong commitment to an investigation of painting and what was possible in painting over many, many decades now, as it is.
Yeah,
And
yes.
in some ways it's linear, and the success is built on one another to where you finally arrive at a body of work that cannot be denied. The truly, as it's been, you know, written about by the writers of our time as very remarkable, unique, original, and so forth, even though it's within the realm of figurative painting. And so the broader audience is no surprise in a way that that's happened now. So
Yeah, yeah. But the other thing, and just I want to mention to you all, to you invisible students out there, is one thing that became very important for me, and is I think it's important for everybody, is networking. Going forward as you get out of graduate school, not networking in the kind of callous, strategic sense of schmoozing, not schmoozing, but networking in the sense of when you get out of graduate school, it's easy to think now I'm free, I can do whatever I want to do, but the kind of support structure you had in graduate school, and the kind of, both with your teachers and with your fellow students, it takes a village to make art, and you have to construct that village, around you for the rest of your life. So it's important to keep in contact with the people that you knew then, or know now, as you go into the future, and also to make new relationships and branch out, and to keep these relationships alive and keep these dialogues alive. It supports your work. Most people I find at least half of my students did their best work in graduate school. You really need a lot more support to keep that going and get better and better after that. So, and what happened to me is I was in New York in the 70s, as I mentioned, made a lot of friends and contacts just in the course of things. And those chickens came home to roost 30 years later. The contacts that I had made then activated things that happened for me in New York. I don't think could have happened if I hadn't had those contacts. I could one by one tell you all these contacts and the serendipity of that. But it just is real. It's not a substitute for the work. You have to have the work. You have to have the work, but that network is necessary to get your work seen. And if you value your work, you want it to be seen. So you want to work on ways to have it seen, and you want to work so that you are reinforced and supported all the time, and that people see you as being an artist all the time, not somebody who just happens to be doing it in addition to whatever else you do.
Yeah. You remember the writer, if you'll recall this, Marinette, that you did the New York summer semester in New York in 1985, that you and Elton Smith, the two professors who took the students there, and I was on that trip.
Oh, that's right. I forgot about that.
Yeah, that was a wonderful program through USF. But I think of it now just because I was remembering the writer Rene Ricard. Do you know Rene Ricard? Yeah. And so many quotable things that he said, but one of the things that he said was that the artist's job is to make the work and get the work in front of me. And those are, the two salient points that as an artist you have to do. And the network that you're mentioning is one of the primary methods. And now, of course,
it's the only way in a way now, because there's no way that you can go to a gallery and show them their work and have them look at it. No galleries look at art. No galleries look at art. They're introduced to the work through someone else or through something else, and then they invite you for a studio visit or something. But it's not. There's no direct way. You have to find indirect ways to get your foot in the door now.
So last question. This is where we're making this a tradition on our Zoom, and it'll probably extend when we're back in person too. But What is a day in the life of Mernet Larsen like in terms of your studio practice or whatever your days are like?
Oh, okay. Well, during the pandemic, that's easy because every day was Groundhog Day. They were identical. Every day was identical except Sunday. And Sunday was different because on Sunday, I would get up, turn on the TV, watch. My husband would make me breakfast, make me eggs. One day a week, I'd have eggs and bacon and um, English muffin, and I would watch Fareed Zakaria and maybe flip and Meet the Press and two things. So on Sunday, that was different. But here's what I did every day. I get up in the morning at about, depending on how well I slept, 7 or 8. Have a bowl of cereal with fruit on it. Read the paper, New York Times and the Tampa Bay paper. Then I would go in and work for 3 hours. And in the middle of that working, I would have a scone and a cup of coffee, my first cup of coffee in the middle of the morning. Work for till 12:30 or so. And then I would take off and lie down usually and read or nap or do chores or whatever, do the laundry. And anyway, I would take off for a few hours in the middle of the afternoon. And then at about 4, I would have one of those little 2-bite brownies and a cup of coffee. I mean, if I had any coffee left in my thermos. And then I would work for another 2 or 3 hours. And then at 6:30, I would go make the salad while Roger made dinner. And then we would watch the news. And then, to my eternal shame, probably, we would watch TV for 3 or 4 hours. and so now I'm an expert on Scandinavian noir mysteries and countless other series that we addictively watched over the last year. I've never done that kind of thing before.
Nice.
I once in a while I do something at night too. I do emails or sometimes even work, but usually I didn't work more than about 6 hours a day, I'd say. Now though, in the last few months, we've got 3 times a week we go for a walk in the woods, in Florida woods. It's been absolutely beautiful, incredible old Florida. We live in a section where there's a lot of
Nice.
Florida, not commercial Florida, and that's been really, really, really nice. But that's what a day is. And I'm 7 day. I work 7 days a week. Haven't had any breaks for the whole pandemic. We never went out of the house during the whole pandemic, except for those walks in the woods. Never went to the store. Got all our food from Amazon delivered. Didn't see any friends except on Zoom. Just totally in total quarantine isolation. And actually, it's been a good year. It's been a good year. In many respects.
One question: since the inauguration, have you found yourself less interested in the news?
Yes, fortunately, less obsessed.
Yeah.
What a relief. I mean, did not have to be thinking about that all the time.
Yes.
Especially as it neared the election of almost terror of what if this goes wrong?
Yes. Well, so wonderful. Marinette, thank you for sharing with us. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome. I enjoyed it thoroughly.
Yeah.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Yes. And I hope you'll come to Houston sometime and see our fair city in person.
I mean, I know so much about it, good and bad, because it's all the attention it gets.
Yeah.
It would be interesting.
There's much good about it. I assure you of that. Yes.
I'm sure there is. I know there is.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'll see you in a little bit on the, at let me think, 3 o'clock your time on the other Zoom for the
Oh,
next.
is that an hour from now? I don't know. What time it is
It's
now.
about a half hour. We're
Okay.
26, so it's, yeah, about 30 minutes from now. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Okay. Thank you all for coming.